first thing you noticed was not the absence of sound, it was the absence of change. Every display in front of you glowed a familiar, reassuring green. Power level stable. Gate alignment holding perfectly. Internal diagnostics reporting nothing. Out of tolerance. The relay station was functioning exactly as designed, to exactly, normally. There was always movement. Data bursts arriving and leaving in steady rhythms. Automated traffic pings. Background chatter from distant ships checking. Alignment before transit. It was never loud, never intrusive, but it was always there. Like a heartbeat you only noticed when it stopped. You leaned forward in your chair, eyes scanning the communication logs again. Last confirmed transmission 72 hours ago. That was impossible, even in the quietest regions of known space. Something always passed through eventually. A survey drone, a cargo hauler running behind schedule, an automated beacon updating its position. Relay existed precisely because the galaxy depended on it. You ran a manual refresh, fingers moving more out of habit than hope. Nothing. The silence pressed in on you slowly, not with panic, but with unease. Kind that settled in your chest and stayed there, heavy and patient. You checked the secondary channels, then the tertiary emergency bands. Legacy frequencies that hadn't been used in decades, but were still maintained because protocol demanded. It still nothing. You exhaled slowly and spoke, your voice sounding unfamiliar in the empty control room. Relay Station 89, status check. Your words echoed softly off the curved walls before being swallowed by the hum of the station. The system dutifully logged your transmission and sent it outward into space. No reply came back. You told yourself this didn't mean anything yet. Silence alone wasn't evidence. Systems failed. Routes shifted. The galaxy was vast, but the silence was complete. You stood and walked toward the observation window. Beyond the reinforced glass, the relay gate hung in open space, enormous, precise, and unmoving. Rings aligned perfectly, energy field steady. It looked exactly as it had every day since you arrived. Stars drifted slowly behind it, distant. Indifferent. The galaxy was still out there. It just wasn't talking to you. You pulled up the duty manual next, scrolling past sections you'd never needed before. Most relay operators didn't. Their job was to monitor, not decide. Authority came from above, from councils and command structures so far removed that their names barely mattered. Until now. Your eyes stopped on a section highlighted in yellow. Extended communication loss protocol. You frowned slightly. This was the part no one talked about during training. It was mentioned once briefly, and then moved past as if it were theoretical. You began to read. In the event of prolonged silence exceeding standard operational thresholds, your fingers tightened on the console as you scrolled. The station custodian is authorized to maintain operations independently until contact is restored. Custodian. The word felt heavier than it should have. You had never thought of yourself as anything more than a caretaker. Someone who watched systems run smoothly and logged irregularities for someone else to worry about. But silence changed things. You left the protocol open and returned to the communication panel, opening a wide band receiver and leaving it exposed to raw input. Static filled the speakers, soft, steady, almost comforting in its consistency. Minutes passed. Then more. You were just about to lower the volume when the static shifted. At first, it was so faint you wondered if you imagined it. A distortion. A ripple where there shouldn't have been one. You froze. The sound came again, not noise this time, but structure, rhythm, something shaped by breath. You leaned closer, heart beating a little faster now. Hello. The word barely held together, fragmented by interference, but it was unmistakable, human. You didn't answer right away. You couldn't. The moment felt fragile, like speaking too quickly might break it. The voice returned, strained but real. Is anyone receiving this? I've been broadcasting for hours. Your hand hovered over the transmit control. This wasn't just a signal. It was a person. You swallowed and spoke carefully, steadily. This is Relay Station 89. I'm receiving you. There was silence on the other end, not static. This time, but stunned quiet. Then a breath you could almost feel through the speaker's bow. Thank God. The relief in that single phrase hit harder than any alarm ever could. You stared at the panel, suddenly aware that whatever had happened to the galaxy, whatever had caused the silence, it hadn't taken everyone. Not yet, and for reasons you didn't understand. This one voice voice had reached you. For several seconds after you answered, neither of you spoke. The channel remained open, filled only with faint static and the distant hum of the relay station systems. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was cautious, like both of you were afraid that speaking too quickly might undo whatever fragile connection had just formed. Finally, the voice returned. I didn't think anyone was still monitoring the relays, he said quietly. I was starting to believe I was broadcasting into nothing. You adjusted the receiver sensitivity, narrowing the band to stabilize the signal. The distortion eased slightly, not enough to make the transmission clean, but enough to give the voice weight, presence. This station is still operational. You said communications went dark 72 hours ago. You're the first transmission I've received since. There was a soft exhale on the other end. Relief, unmistakable even through interference. My name is Eli, he said. I'm not supposed to be here. That statement stayed with you longer than it should have. You asked for his location, coordinates, system markers, anything that could anchor his voice to a place. Eli hesitated. I can give you an approximate vector, he said, but I don't know where I am anymore. The nav ray stopped updating after the shutdown order. Shutdown order? You hadn't heard those words spoken out loud yet. Seeing them in logs was one thing. Hearing someone acknowledge them made the silence feel deliberate in a way that data never could. Who issued the order? You asked. There was another pause. This one heavier. Everyone, Eli said. Or no one. Depends how you look at it, he explained slowly, carefully, as though choosing the wrong words might trigger something listening in the dark. The first directives had come through clean channels, official, verified. Reduce traffic, limit transmissions, shift to passive monitoring only. It had been framed as precautionary, temporary, a response to something unidentified moving along the communication lattice. At first, we thought it was a sensor error, Eli said. Then ships started vanishing, not exploding, not leaving debris, just dropping off the network. You glanced at the relay gate through the observation window. It remained steady, massive and indifferent, as if none of this concerned it. They said the signals were the problem, Eli continued. That whatever it was, it followed communication. Active channels made it stronger, louder. So they chose silence, you said, double quotes, yes. The word landed with quiet finality. Silence as policy. Silence as protection. You felt the weight of it settle in your chest. The galaxy hadn't gone quiet by accident. It had made a collective decision to stop speaking and then abandon the systems that had once carried those voices. Why are you still transmitting? You asked. Eli laughed softly, without humor. Because I never got the follow-up order. That surprised you. I was running diagnostics on a deep-range listening array when the blackout hit, he explained. My sector went quiet before the command net did. By the time I realized what was happening, the channel I was on was already marked as deprecated, forgotten. Forgotten. The word echoed something you'd have been trying not to name. I waited, Eli said. Like they told us to. Hours turned into days. Power dropped to emergency levels. I kept telling myself someone would check in. You said nothing. You already knew how that felt. When no one did, he continued, I started broadcasting. Low power. Narrow band. Just enough to say I was here. You looked back at the protocol still open on your console. Custodial discretion. Maintain operations independently. I shouldn't exist on the network anymore, Eli said. The silence worked. I would have been erased along with it. The realization crept in slowly, unsettling in its simplicity. Eli wasn't a failure of the system. He was evidence of its cost. You didn't tell him that. Not yet. Instead, you asked him to keep talking, to tell you anything about his station. His last confirmed readings, his condition. As he spoke, you began logging again. Not because protocol demanded it, but because this mattered. Because if one voice had made it through, there could be others, or there could be consequences. You felt it then, the shift. The quiet understanding that this wasn't just about listening anymore. This was about deciding what silence was allowed to erase, and whether you were willing to let it continue. Asterisk. After Eli finished explaining how he had been left behind, the channel settled into a rhythm that felt almost fragile. You spoke less now. Not because there was nothing to say, but because listening had become more important. Eli filled the silence with details, not dramatic ones. Not confessions, but ordinary observations that somehow made the situation feel heavier. He told you about the station he had been assigned to, a small listening post position far beyond major trade routes, designed to detect long-range anomalies before they reach populated space. It had never been meant to be occupied for long periods. Rotations were frequent, oversight constant, until it wasn't. When the blackout order came through, Eli said, they framed it like a temporary weather advisory: minimize activity, preserve resources, await further instruction. You pictured it easily, the kind of directive that sounded sensible on paper, kind that assumed someone would always come back with clarification. They told us the silence would last a few hours, he continued, then a day, then nothing. You asked him how long. He had been alone. For days, Eli replied. Maybe 5. Time gets unreliable when the clock stops sensing. You glance at your own timekeeping systems. They were still synchronized to reference beacons that no longer transmitted updates. You hadn't thought about what that meant. Yet Eli described the gradual changes the way systems powered down in stages. How certain automated routines simply ceased to run once they stopped receiving authorization pings. Not because they were broken, but because they were waiting for confirmation that never arrived. It's strange, he said. Everything still works. Just not for me. You understood that too well. The relay station around you was pristine, efficient, and obedient. It didn't care that the galaxy had stopped issuing commands. It simply continued doing what it was designed to do, waiting for voices that never came. You asked Eli if he had attempted to reach anyone else. All the time, he said. At first I used official channels, then emergency bands, then old legacy frequencies they barely teach anymore. He paused. Most of them were already quiet. That detail sat with you longer than the rest. The silence hadn't spread outward uniformly. It had appeared in patches, regions going dark before others. Stations losing contact not because of failure, but because they had been quietly excluded. You thought about your own position. Date 9 wasn't a priority relay. It existed to support routes that were considered secondary, redundant, useful, but not critical, which meant no one had rushed to check on you when the silence fell. Do you think they know you're still transmitting? You asked. Eli hesitated. I don't know. That's what scares me. He explained that he had been careful. Low output, narrow beams, short bursts, enough to announce existence, without drawing too much attention, whatever attention meant now. I wasn't trying to be rescued, he said. I just didn't want to disappear without a trace. The admission felt raw in a way Eli hadn't sounded before. You leaned back in your chair, eyes drifting to the observation window again. The relay gate was still there, immense and patient, as if waiting for permission to matter again. You asked Eli if he had noticed anything unusual before the shutdown. Any anomalies, any patterns? Yes, he said quietly, but they told us to stop looking. He described subtle distortions in signal propagation, slight delays that didn't match known interference models. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to be inconvenient, like something was listening, Eli said, not intelligently, more like resonance. Signals interacting with something that wasn't supposed to be there. You didn't respond immediately. You didn't need to. The implications spoke for themselves. Silence hadn't been chosen randomly. It had been chosen because someone somewhere believed that being heard was dangerous. You pulled up the relay's routing maps, tracing inactive paths with your finger. Entire regions had gone dark not because they were destroyed, but because someone had decided the risk of connection outweighed the cost of isolation. Eli was the cost. And now, so were you. Because by answering him, you had already broken the silence. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, inevitable. You told Eli you would stay on the channel as long as you could. Thank you, he said. Just hearing another person makes it easier to breathe. You watched the logs continue to fill timestamps, signal strength, the voice packets preserved in data. Evidence that conversation still existed, that someone still believed it mattered. And for the first time since the silence began, you allowed yourself to consider a possibility that felt both hopeful and dangerous. If one voice had reached you, the silence might not be as complete as the galaxy wanted it to be. You didn't notice the moment the responsibility shifted. There was no alarm to mark it, no line in the protocol that said this is where observation becomes participation. relay station continued to hum quietly around you, its systems indifferent to the fact that something fundamental had changed, but you felt it all the same. The channel with Eli remained open. A thin thread stretched across a galaxy that had chosen to go quiet. You could have closed it, logged the transmission, filed it under anomaly, and returned to waiting. That would have been the correct action. You stared at the protocol window still floating beside your console. Custodial discretion. Maintain operations independently. The language was careful, deliberately vague, written by committees that never imagined silence would last this long. Custodians were meant to preserve systems, not make decisions, and yet here you were doing both. Are you still there? Eli asked softly. I'm here, you replied. Saying it out loud made it real. You asked Eli to describe the moment he realized the silence wasn't temporary. He took a few seconds before answering, as if replaying something he hadn't wanted to examine too closely. When the automated check-ins stopped, he said, not the big ones, the small ones. Routine pings from systems that never missed a cycle. You nodded. Even though he couldn't see it, those were the kinds of signals no one thought about. Background confirmations that proved the galaxy was still paying attention. When those went quiet, Eli continued. I knew someone had decided not to look anymore. The word stayed with you. Decided not to look. Silence wasn't just absence. It was a choice reinforced again and again, cycle after cycle. By systems obeying orders they no longer understood, you pulled up the relay's authority tree, tracing it backward through layers of outdated governance, councils that hadn't convened, fleets that had been recalled, oversight nodes that returned nothing but error messages. There was no one left to defer to, and that meant the decision wasn't yours in theory, but it was yours in practice. You asked Eli if anyone had warned him about what might happen to stations, like as once the silence went into effect. No, he said, they focused on population centers. Fleets, trade hubs, places that mattered. You didn't miss the implication that places like yours, places like his, outposts that existed to serve the larger system had become expendable. Once the system decided to protect itself, you felt a quiet anger rise, not sharp enough to act on, but steady and persistent, the kind that came from realizing that efficiency had been allowed to override responsibility. What happens if the silence continues? You asked. Eli didn't answer right away. People disappear, he said eventually. Not all at once. Just one by one, stations go dark, ships drift. Entire regions become empty because no one thought to check. You glanced again at the relay gate. It had moved civilizations across unimaginable distances. It had shortened travel times, built economies, shaped borders. And now it stood idle because someone had decided that connection was too dangerous. You wondered how many others were out there like Eli, alive, waiting, slowly realizing that no one was coming. You shouldn't be talking to me, Eli said suddenly. The statement caught you off guard. What do you mean? You asked. I mean, if the silence exists for a reason, he said. If something listens, then you're risking more than just procedure. You considered that. You had been considering it since the moment you answered him. I know. You said you didn't elaborate. You didn't need to. The truth was simple. The decision had already been made the moment you spoke back. Everything after that was just consequence. You weren't trying to defy the galaxy. You weren't trying to fix what had broken. You were doing what custodians did when systems failed. You kept things running. You asked Eli to conserve his power, to transmit only when necessary, to stay alive. I can do that, he said. As long as you stay on the other end. I will, you replied. And as the words left your mouth, you understood what they meant. You were no longer waiting for orders. You were choosing to listen. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between stars, that choice mattered more than any command the galaxy had ever issued. Asterisk, you waited a long time before asking the question, not because it wasn't important, but because you understood what it meant to ask it. Once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. It would turn the silence from an abstract policy into something shaped, something with edges. What did you see first? You asked Eli finally, before everything went quiet. The channel crackled softly as the receiver compensated for a subtle shift in signal strength. Eli answered. His voice was lower than before. We didn't see it, he said. That was the problem. You closed the secondary diagnostic panel and leaned back, letting the station's hum fill the spaces between words. narration's behaving strangely. Not failing, responding. You straightened slightly. At first, it looked like lag. He said, messages arriving late. Signal echoes repeating at intervals that didn't match any known reflection models. Nothing dramatic enough to justify panic. That matched what you had seen in archived reports, minor anomalies dismissed as noise. The kind of data that rarely survived past review meetings. Then the echoes started changing, Eli said, adapting. You let the words settle. They followed traffic density, he went on. Where more signals passed through, the anomalies became stronger, clearer. As if something was learning how to listen by listening, you pulled up the relay's historical logs, filtering by distortion flags that had been automatically deprioritized months ago. There they were, small, almost embarrassing deviations from expected values. You had never thought twice about them. What did Command think? You asked. They didn't want to name it, Eli said. Naming things makes them real. Instead, they focused on mitigation. Double quotes, silence. You understood the logic immediately. If communication itself was the vector, then the safest option was to reduce exposure. Limit transmissions, shut down non-essential channels, turn the galaxy quiet until whatever was listening lost interest. It wasn't fear, Eli added. Not exactly. It was efficiency. Silence was cheaper than investigation. The statement made something inside you tighten. You asked if there had been dissent. Scientists, analysts, anyone who argued for understanding rather than withdrawal, yes. Eli said briefly. You didn't need him to explain what happened to them. They said it might not be hostile, he continued, that it could be a natural phenomenon or something emergent, byproduct of too many signals crossing too much space. He paused. But no one wanted to risk being wrong. You looked at the relay gate again. For centuries it had carried voices, data, intent compressing distance until communication felt instantaneous. You wondered how much of the galaxy's identity had been built on the assumption that speaking was safe. When did they decide to stop talking completely? You asked. Their listening array went dark, Eli said. Not destroyed, not damaged, just empty, systems intact. No crew, no distress call. Your breath slowed, deliberate. They thought it had been drawn there by activity, Eli continued. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. You finished the thought silently. They made absence a defense. You thought of the relay's architecture, how it amplified, redirected, and preserved signals. How it had never been designed to question whether communication itself could be dangerous. And people like you asked. Outposts, peripheral stations. We were collateral, Eli said, without bitterness. Necessary losses. The silence wasn't meant to save everyone. The honesty of that statement struck harder than fear ever could have. You realized then that the silence wasn't just about survival. It was about control. Silence allowed decisions to be made without scrutiny, without accountability, without voices complicating the narrative. And now, here you were maintaining one of the few systems still capable of breaking it. Do you think it's still listening? You asked. Eli didn't answer right away. I don't know, he said finally, but I know this: if it is, then it already knows the galaxy exists. The channel fell quiet again, but not empty this time. You stared at the logs filling with Ellie's voice packets, evidence that connection still lived somewhere in the system. Silence hadn't erased everything, it had just made survival quieter. And for the first time, you understood exactly what had been sacrificed to achieve it. After Eli finished explaining what the silence had been built to contain, neither of you spoke for a long time, not because there was nothing left to say, but because saying anything felt heavier now. The quiet between words had changed. It wasn't empty anymore, it was occupied by understanding. You were the first to break it. How long can you keep transmitting? You asked. Ellie's response came slower than before, as if he were checking internal readings while he spoke. A few days, maybe, if I ration power. Less if I'm careful. Or if I'm lucky. Lucky was not a metric either of you trusted anymore. You looked at the relay's energy reserves. Theta 9 could operate autonomously for months, years, even if nothing catastrophic occurred. It had been designed to outlast wars, political collapses, supply chain failures. It hadn't been designed to outlast abandonment. Why didn't they evacuate stations like yours? You asked quietly. Eli gave a small, tired laugh. Evacuations require coordination. Coordination requires communication. by the time they decided silence was necessary. Evacuation was already a contradiction. The logic was brutally clean. You understood then that the silence wasn't just defensive, it was irreversible by design. Once enacted, it cut off the very mechanisms needed to undo it safely. People like me weren't part of the calculation, Eli continued. Not because we didn't matter, but because we were inconvenient. You let that word linger. Inconvenient lives died. It reframed everything you had read in the protocols. Every carefully neutral sentence about operational efficiency and acceptable laws. Silence wasn't just about preventing harm, it was about simplifying. Responsibility. You asked Eli why he hadn't stopped transmitting once he realized the risk. I tried. He said, for a while, you waited. There's something about silence, he continued. It changes how you think. At first it feels peaceful, then it starts to feel like pressure, like something pushing in on you from all sides. You glance at the walls of the relay station, smooth, clean, endlessly functional. Designed for one person, designed for quiet. I realized something Eli said. If I stopped talking, nothing would happen, no alarm, no acknowledgement. It would be as if I had never been here. That sentence landed with a weight you felt physically. You had spent your career ensuring messages arrived where they were supposed to go. That voices were delivered, logged, preserved. You had never considered what happened to voices that were deliberately excluded. You mattered because you spoke, you said. Yes, Eli replied, and because someone listened. The simplicity of it felt almost dangerous. You began to see the silence differently, not as a shield, but as a filter. A way of deciding which lives were visible and which could be quietly erased without consequence. One voice slipping through that filter wasn't a failure. It was a flaw in the assumption that silence could be controlled. Do you think others tried, you asked? I know they did, Eli said. I heard fragments, weak signals, bursts that didn't last long. Some stopped suddenly, some faded. You felt a quiet grief settle in, slow and steady, and you kept going. You said, double quotes, yes. You adjusted the relay's monitoring parameters, extending the passive listening range just slightly, not enough to announce your presence widely, just enough to widen the net. Eli noticed the change immediately. You're boosting the receiver, he said. Only a little, you replied. Enough to hear what's already there. He didn't tell you to stop. You both understood the risk now, not in abstract terms, but in consequences measured in attention. In the possibility that something might notice, not just that voices existed, but that they were being gathered. Why does one voice matter? Eli asked quietly, almost to himself. You thought about that before answering, because it proves the silence isn't complete, you said. And if it isn't complete, then it isn't absolute. The relay station hummed softly, unaware of the significance of what it was doing. One voice had crossed the gap. One listener had answered, and somewhere in the space between them, the galaxy's carefully maintained quiet had begun to fracture, not with noise, but with connection. Asterisk, the realization arrived slowly, the way most important things did in deep space, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet alignment of thoughts that had been circling each other for days. The relay station was humming the same way it always had. Power flow steady, structural integrity nominal. Signal processors idle but alert. Everything about it suggested readiness. Waiting. You had spent years believing that waiting was its primary function. Receive, route, deliver, stand by. But now, with the galaxy silent and one voice threaded through the static, you began to see the station for what it truly was. Relays were never designed for silence. They were built to connect. Every component around you existed for a single purpose: to reduce distance, to take fragile signals and carry them safely across voids that would otherwise swallow them whole. Silence was never an intended state. It was an emergency condition at best, a temporary failure mode. And yet, here the station was obediently quiet, doing nothing wrong, while everything it had been built for went unused. I've been thinking, you said at last. Ellie's response came immediately, as if he had been waiting for you to speak. That usually means something's about to change. You allowed yourself a faint smile. I was trained to maintain neutrality, you said, to keep the system stable regardless of what passes through it. But neutrality only works when the system itself is being used as intended. You gestured toward the control panels, even though Eli couldn't see them right now. The relay isn't neutral, It's complicit. There was a pause on the line, not static consideration. You're saying the silence isn't just happening, Eli said slowly. It's being upheld. Yes. The word felt heavier spoken aloud. You explained what you had begun to notice in the system architecture. How the relay's default state wasn't inactivity, but readiness. How silence required constant reinforcement filters applied, channels closed, permissions revoked. The system had to be actively restrained to remain quiet. They didn't just shut it down, you said. They told it not to listen. Eli let out a quiet breath. So the silence takes effort, more than speaking ever did. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. The galaxy was spending energy, attention, and resources to maintain its quiet. Silence wasn't a natural outcome. It was a maintained condition. You pulled up a deep layer diagnostic, one that most custodians never accessed, because it rarely mattered. The relay's legacy functions were still there, dormant but intact. Routines designed to route signals through unconventional, positive primary channels failed, emergency meshes, whisper routes, pods that existed precisely because communication was considered too important to lose completely. They planned for failure, you said, just not for abandonment. Eli was quiet now, listening. I think that's why your signal made it through, you continued. You weren't supposed to. But the system doesn't like being told to forget its purpose. You felt something shift as you said it, in the relay within yourself. For the first time since the silence began, you weren't reacting anymore. You were evaluating. Can you do something? Eli asked. Careful not to push, you considered the question, not technically, but ethically. Yes, you said, but it won't be loud, and it won't be safe. You explained the idea slowly. The relay could reopen certain listening paths without broadcasting outward. It could hear without calling, collect fragments, map where voices still existed without announcing itself to anything. That might be listening for activity, a quiet rebellion hidden inside compliance. Like whispering into cupped hands, Eli said. Exactly, there were risks. Any deviation from the enforced silence could be noticed. Patterns could emerge. Attention could be drawn. But doing nothing carried its own cost. How many others might still be out there? Eli asked. You didn't answer right away. You were thinking of the fragments he had mentioned, the weak bursts, the signals that faded. Enough that pretending they don't exist feels wrong, you said. The relay station responded as you began to adjust parameters. Nothing dramatic. No alarms. Just a subtle change in how it listened to the void for the first time in days. The static gained texture, not voices, not yet, but potential. You felt a quiet sense of resolve. Settle in. Kind that didn't need urgency to be powerful. The galaxy had chosen silence because it was afraid of being heard. You were beginning to understand something else entirely. Being unheard was its own kind of danger, and the relay patient, resilient, and stubbornly alive was finally being allowed to do what it had always been meant to do. You didn't enable the changes all at once. That would have felt reckless, loud, kind of mistake that drew attention simply by existing instead. You adjusted the relay the way a careful listener, leaned closer to a quiet room slowly, deliberately, pausing often to make sure nothing shifted in response. The station accepted every change without protest that it always had. Eli noticed the difference before you mentioned it. The static sounds. Different, he said, like it's layered now. That's because it is, you replied. Relay is listening along paths it hasn't used in a long time. You explained what you were doing in simple terms. You weren't opening channels. You weren't sending signals outward. Just allowing the station to hear what was already moving through space. Fragments that bounced and decayed. Echoes of conversations that had ended days or weeks ago. Ghost traffic dotted, but safer than broadcasting, but not without risk. Listening still created patterns. Patterns could be detected by anything that cared enough to look. Are you sure this won't expose you? Eli asked. You considered the question carefully. Not because you didn't know the answer, but because knowing it didn't make it easier. No, you said. I'm sure it might. The honesty felt important. Relay's processors began sorting what they found. Most of it was noise, random interference, background radiation masquerading as structure. But beneath it all, there were hints of something else, not voices yet. Were like absence shaped in recognizable ways, places where signals had stopped. bubbly dot places where traffic should have existed but didn't. It's like seeing footprints in snow. Eli murmured as you described the redouts. You don't see the person. You just know they were there. Yes, you said, and that they left quickly. You realized then that silence hadn't spread evenly. It had moved like a decision rolling outward, some regions shutting down faster than others, some resisting. Longer dot not because they were braver, because they were slower to comply. You felt a flicker of something like guilt. Fate 9 had survived not because it was protected, but because it was overlooked. Forgotten systems were harder to silence completely. Do you think it's still out there? Eli asked quietly. You knew what he meant. The thing, the phenomenon. Whatever had prompted the councils to retreat into quiet. I don't know, you said. But I think it doesn't matter anymore. How can it not matter? You hesitated, choosing your words carefully. Because silence didn't stop it, you said. It just changed who paid the price. The relay flagged a pattern weak, intermittent, but undeniably structured. You froze, eyes locked on the display. Eli, you said slowly, I'm detecting something. His breathing changed immediately, sharper, more focused, a signal, not exactly a response. The word hung between you, it's not answering. You continued, it's reacting to the absence, to where signals should be. You realized then how flawed the galaxy solution had been. Silence hadn't hidden anyone. It had created contrast, a map of where life used to speak. Like a shadow that only exists because of light, Eli said. Yes, the implication was terrifying in its subtlety. By choosing silence, Galaxy had taught whatever was listening exactly where to look. You shut down several listening paths immediately, scaling back the changes. Relay obeyed, quieting its awareness without complaint. Your heart took a long moment to slow. We need to be careful, Eli said, if it reacts to patterns. Then even listening could be dangerous, you nodded, even though he couldn't see it. But we also can't go back to pretending nothing's wrong, you said. That's how this started. The risk of speaking wasn't just external, it was internal. Once you acknowledged what silence cost, you couldn't unsee it. You couldn't return to waiting comfortably. I keep thinking about the people who forgot the chance to speak, Eli said. The ones who followed orders. You didn't respond right away. You were thinking of the relay's whisper routes, the emergency meshes, systems built not for efficiency, but for resilience. There's a difference between silence and quiet, you said finally. Quiet allows for listening. Silence forbids it. The relay station hummed softly as if in agreement. You made a decision then not to speak loudly, not to broadcast hope or warnings, but to remain receptive. To create pockets of quiet where voices could still land safely. It wasn't defiance. It was stewardship. And somewhere in the dark spaces between stars, something shifted not in response to sound, but to intent. The galaxy had gone silent to survive. You were beginning to wonder whether survival required something more. As the relay station did not announce the change, there was no alert, no audible warning, no sudden spike in activity that would have drawn your attention immediately. If you hadn't been watching the diagnostic panel closely, if you hadn't been listening, you might have missed it entirely, a deviation not so slight it almost blended into the background noise. You leaned forward, breath slow and controlled, eyes tracing the pattern as it repeated. It wasn't random, it wasn't interference. It was structured in the way only intent could be. Eli, you said quietly, I think someone just heard us. The channel stayed open, but Eli didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was lower than before. Are you sure? You replayed the data, overlaying it against baseline static. The difference was subtle but undeniable, a modulation where none should exist. Timing sequence to deliver it to be natural. It's not a broadcast, you said. It's a return. A response. You felt a tightening in your chest, not fear exactly, but the awareness that a threshold had just been crossed. Listening had become interaction. You immediately scaled back the relay's sensitivity, narrowing its awareness to the smallest possible aperture. Whatever had reached out had done so briefly, almost tentatively, as if testing whether the silence had truly been broken. What does it look like? Eli asked. Like someone knocking once, you replied, and waiting to see if the door opens. The metaphor felt uncomfortably accurate. You reviewed the signal's origin point. Not a system, not a known route. It appeared to have emerged from a region long considered empty, too sparse to support habitation, Too unstable for infrastructure. That area shouldn't have anything in it, you murmured. Neither should I, Eli said softly, you acknowledged. The parallel without comment. The relay continued to hum, untroubled by the significance of what had just occurred. To it, this was just another anomaly to be categorized. To you, it was proof that silence was no longer absolute. You considered your next steps carefully. Broadcasting a reply would be reckless. Ignoring it entirely felt dishonest, not just to Eli, but to every voice that might still be out there, waiting for confirmation that connection hadn't been erased completely. Do we answer? Eli asked. The question wasn't technical, it was moral. If we do, you said slowly, we teach it that voices lead to more voices. And if we don't, then we confirm that silence still works. Neither option felt safe. You thought about the councils, about their choice to quiet the galaxy rather than understand what was happening. It had bought time, but at the cost of erasing people like Eli, people like you. The first response doesn't have to be loud. You said it doesn't even have to be informative. You adjusted the relay's output settings, configuring a reply that barely qualified as a signal at all. No language, no data, just presence, a heartbeat, a pattern simple enough to be mistaken for noise, but deliberate enough to be recognized by anything that was truly listening. Eli watched the readout silently as you prepared it. This is dangerous, he said. Yes, and you're still doing it. Yes, you initiated the response. For a moment, nothing happened. The relay's indicators returned to the steady, reassuring glow. The stars beyond the observation window drifted as they always had, distant and uncaring. Then the deviation appeared again, stronger this time, not closer but clearer. It hurt us. Eli whispered. You didn't answer. You were too busy watching. Pattern unfold. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't accelerating. It was curious. Whatever it wasn't reacting like a predator. It was reacting like a system encountering resistance for the first time. You realized something the galaxy's leaders had missed. Silence had never been communication. It had been surrender. And this tentative exchange, this careful testing of boundaries was what real interaction looked like. The relay flagged additional faint patterns now, not from the same source, from elsewhere, scattered, weak. Other listeners, other custodians. People who had been watching the silence and decided quietly to do the same thing you had. You're not alone anymore, Eli said, all threading through his voice. No, you replied, we aren't. You closed the channel again, not out of fear, but discipline. First response had been made. Anything more would require coordination, care. Time. The galaxy hadn't remembered how to speak yet, but it had remembered how to listen. And that, you realized, was how everything would begin again. The relay station settled into a new kind of quiet, not the enforced silence that had defined the past days, heavy and deliberate, but something gentler, intentional. That quiet that allowed for listening without demanding absence. You felt the difference immediately, even though nothing visible had changed. The systems around you continued their steady hum. Power flowed, diagnostics refreshed. Stars drifted beyond the observation window as they always had. And yet, the station felt awake in a way it hadn't before. Eli was still on the channel, breathing softly, present. I didn't think it would feel like this, he said at last. Like what? You asked. Like relief, he replied, not because it's over, but because it isn't hopeless anymore. You understood exactly what he meant. The first response had not solved anything. Whatever had prompted the silence still existed. Whatever listened between the signals had not vanished. But something fundamental had shifted. The galaxy was no longer pretending that quiet equaled safety. You reviewed the incoming patterns again. They remained faint, carefully restrained, deliberately subtle, but they were unmistakable. Other relays, other listening posts, other custodians who had made the same decision without coordination, without permission. They weren't speaking loudly. They were acknowledging one another. A network began to take shape, not of broadcasts, but of awareness, a loose mesh of stations allowing themselves to hear, to confirm existence, to share presence without drawing unnecessary attention. The galaxy was remembering how to connect without shouting. Someone just echoed your pattern. Eli said quietly, you checked the timestamp. He was right. A delayed reflection of the heartbeat you had sent earlier returned from a distant node. Not as a reply, but as confirmation. I hear you. You let out a slow breath you hadn't realized you were holding. This was how communication began again, not with declarations or warnings, but with mutual recognition, with restraint, with trust built one signal at a time. What happens now? Eli asked. You considered the question carefully. There was no protocol for this. No guidance from councils that no longer spoke. No authority to defer to. We stay quiet, you said. But not silent. You explained the plan as it formed maintaining. Low-level listening paths sharing minimal patterns. Mapping where awareness still existed without central coordination. A distributed response. No single point of failure. No loud declarations to attract attention. It's slower, Eli said. Yes. You replied. But it's safer, and it doesn't erase anyone. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Do you think they'll ever admit they were wrong? He asked. You glanced at the archive directive still sitting unread on a secondary display. Maybe you said. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that people stopped waiting for permission to care. The relay station logged another faint acknowledgement, then another. Each one a small affirmation that the galaxy had not gone entirely dark only. Quiet long enough to forget itself. You thought about the councils, wherever they were now. About the fleets, the closed channels, the sealed systems they would eventually notice. Silence could not hide the fact that connection had resumed even at this minimal level. When they did, they would have a choice, reassert control, or listen. Am I still in danger? Eli asked softly. Yes, you said honestly, but you're not alone anymore. That mattered more than safety ever had. You began drafting a quiet message, one that wouldn't be sent outward but inward. Preserve in the relay's long-term memory. A record not of commands or warnings, but of intent. Silence was chosen to protect us. Connection was chosen to save us. You saved it without assigning priority. Some things didn't need to be urgent to endure. Hours passed, then more. The network of listeners held steady, careful not to grow too quickly. Careful not to draw attention it couldn't yet handle. Ellie's power level stabilized once he adjusted his transmission schedule. Rescue would come eventually, not because someone ordered it, but because someone would notice him through the quiet web now forming, not loud. Not immediate, but inevitable as you lean back in your chair. The relay station continuing its patient work around you. You realized something that surprised you with its simplicity. The galaxy hadn't been saved by silence. It hadn't been saved by bravery or force either. It had been saved by people who chose to listen when listening felt dangerous and who spoke just enough to remind one another that they were still there. Outside, the stars drifted on, unchanged. Inside the network, voices waited not to dominate the dark, but to share it, and for the first time since the silence began, the galaxy was no longer holding its breath.